They married me to a man 20 years older. I was 19 years old when my parents started acting strange around me. At first, it was small things. My mother began criticizing the clothes I wore around the house, saying I was no longer a child. My father, who normally barely paid attention to what I did, started asking where I was going, who I was talking to, and why I spent so long on the phone with my friends. I thought it was just another phase of theirs, perhaps excessive worry, perhaps some family gossip. In households like ours, any comment from relatives seemed to take on too much importance, but there was something different in the air. I remember exactly the night everything truly began. It was very hot, and the kitchen fan made an annoying noise while my mother prepared tea. I had just finished washing the dishes when she asked me to sit down. That already made me nervous, because my mother never made a ceremony of talking to me. She usually spoke while folding laundry or stirring pots. That night, it seemed she had rehearsed every word. My father came in shortly after and sat in silence. That was when my heart started beating strangely. My mother held my hand and said, "Your aunt met a very good family." Right then, I felt a chill in my stomach. Not because she had said anything frightening, but because I grew up hearing that kind of phrase in the conversations of the women in our family. Good family, hardworking man, respected, stable. These were words that almost always ended on the same subject: marriage. I tried to smile, pretending I hadn't understood. "And what does that have to do with me?" My father answered before she could. "They're looking for a wife for their son." I still remember the exact feeling of that moment. It was as if the heat of the kitchen had suddenly disappeared. I stared at both of them without knowing whether this was a normal conversation or a decision already made. I asked his age, and my father hesitated for just a second before answering. 39. I thought I had heard wrong. 39? My voice came out louder than I intended. My mother immediately tried to soften it, saying he was a very respected man, that he had a good business, a stable life. But I could barely hear the rest. All I could think was that this man was 20 years older than me. I was 19. I still shared silly secrets with my friends, still laughed watching videos in secret in the middle of the night, still feared disappointing my parents over small things. And suddenly they were talking about marrying me off to a man who was practically twice my age. The first thing I asked was why he wanted to marry someone so much younger. The silence from my parents frightened me more than any answer. My father cleared his throat and said only, "Because you are a good girl." That night I barely slept. I lay staring at the ceiling while listening to dogs barking in the street and tried to picture that man's face. I couldn't. Every time I tried to imagine my future, a bad feeling came in my chest, as if my life were moving too fast for me to keep up. The next day I tried to act normally, but my mind was elsewhere. My best friend noticed immediately. She asked what had happened, and I made up some excuse. I couldn't tell her, perhaps because, deep down, saying it out loud would make everything feel even more real. The days passed, and the subject did not disappear. On the contrary, my aunt began appearing at the house almost every day, always smiling, always talking about how respected that family was, how I would have a comfortable life, how happy my parents were with the proposal. Nobody asked what I wanted. That was the part that hurt the most. I tried to understand whether this was just a conversation, or whether they had already decided my life without me. Sometimes my mother would notice my silence and say, "You'll understand when you're older." But I already felt far too old in that situation. A week later, they said he would come to meet me. I spent the whole day nervous. My mother picked out clothes for me, fixed my hair several times, and kept repeating that I needed to look calm. But how does anyone stay calm in a situation like that? When I heard the car arriving, my hands started to sweat. My father went to receive him at the door, and I stood still in the living room, feeling my heart beat so loudly it seemed impossible that nobody could hear it. Then he came in. The first thing I thought was that he looked even older in person. He was not an unattractive man. He had an elegant posture, a well-groomed beard, plain clothes, and a calm way of speaking, but he seemed like a man from a different stage of life, someone who had already lived through a great deal while I was still trying to discover who I was. He greeted me politely, and that confused me even further. I wanted to find some clear reason to reject the whole thing. I wanted him to be arrogant, rude, or unpleasant. It would have been easier to hate the situation. But he seemed kind. The adults began talking about family, work, and future plans, while I remained quiet, holding a cup of tea that had already gone cold in my hands. At one point, he looked at me and asked if I liked to read. The question caught me off guard. I nodded slowly and he smiled. "Your aunt mentioned that. I love reading too." It was a simple, brief exchange, but the discomfort never left me for even a second. While he spoke calmly, All I could think was that this man could easily have had a daughter close to my age. After he left, I went straight to my room. My mother came in right behind me with a smile I had known since childhood. It was the smile she wore when she believed something important was finally coming together. "He liked you very much," she said. I sat on the bed without answering. She noticed my eyes filling with tears and immediately sat beside me. "My dear, I know it seems frightening right now, but he is a good man." That phrase stayed in my head. A good man. Perhaps he truly was. Perhaps that was precisely the problem, because I was not afraid of cruelty. I was afraid of the idea of handing over my entire life to someone I barely knew. 2 days later, my aunt appeared early at the house, smiling before she had even stepped through the door. And before she said a word, I knew. I knew it from my mother's expression, from my father's quiet pride. The family had accepted the marriage. That night, I sat alone by the window of my room, watching the lights of the neighboring houses. Somewhere on the street, children were playing and laughing loudly, and for a few seconds I felt envious of them, envious of that simple lightness that I seemed to have suddenly lost, because for the first time in my life, I had the feeling that my future no longer belonged to me. After the families confirmed the wedding, my home changed completely. It was strange to notice how everything around me seemed more animated at precisely the moment when I felt increasingly lost. My aunts began appearing almost every day, bringing fabrics, borrowed jewelry, decoration suggestions, and comments about guests. My mother walked through the house with a list in her hand at all times, worried about details I could barely follow. Even my father seemed lighter, as if he had finally solved a problem he had been carrying for a long time. And perhaps he had. Today I can understand things that at the time seemed impossible to accept. My father came from a generation where stability meant security. To him, a respected, financially secure man who was interested in marrying me was almost a guarantee that I would have a protected life. I think, in his mind, he was taking care of my future. But at 19, all I felt was fear. The worst part was that I couldn't explain exactly why. It wasn't like in the movies where there is an obvious villain or someone cruel forcing a girl to do something. Nobody shouted at me. Nobody locked me inside the house. My parents remained affectionate, and precisely because of that, everything felt even more confusing inside my head. Because how do you fight against people who believe they are doing what is best for you? Sometimes I thought about saying no. I thought about simply walking into the room and saying I didn't want that marriage. But then I would picture my father's face, my mother's disappointment, the comments from the entire family, and the words died before they ever left my mouth. I began to feel guilty for being unhappy. That was perhaps the hardest part of all. While everyone was celebrating, I spent hours shut in my room staring at my phone without really paying attention to anything. My friends sent messages asking about the preparations, wanting photos, making jokes about marriage. Some even said I was lucky to be marrying a mature, successful man. I responded with emojis and short phrases because I didn't know how to explain what was really happening inside me. One afternoon, my best friend showed up at the house unannounced. She had known me since childhood, so she noticed immediately that something was wrong. When we were finally alone in my room, she asked, "Do you like him?" The question seemed simple, but it completely undid me. I sat on the bed not knowing what to answer, because the truth was too strange even for me. I didn't hate that man, but I couldn't imagine love either. Everything was happening too fast. I had spoken with him only a few times, always in front of the family, always in controlled settings, always surrounded by watchful eyes. How could anyone build a genuine feeling under those circumstances? "I don't even know him properly," I replied quietly. My friend was silent for a few seconds. "Then why are you doing this?" That question kept echoing in my head long after she left. That night, I thought about it while helping my mother in the kitchen. She seemed tired, but happy. At one point, she looked at me smiling and said, "Your life is going to change a great deal now." Normally, a phrase like that should have sounded exciting, but for me, it had the opposite effect. I felt such a tight pressure in my chest that I had to lower my head so she wouldn't notice my eyes filling with tears. A few days later, I began talking to him more on the phone. He was always the one who called, always in the early evening, and that made me nervous from the moment the phone began to ring. He was polite. He would ask about my day, about the preparations, about simple things in my routine. Sometimes he spoke about work, about trips he had taken, about restaurants he liked. And the more I listened, the more I felt the distance between us. He spoke like someone completely formed, while I still felt lost trying to understand my own life. Once he casually mentioned a trip he had taken many years earlier, and I realized that while he was living those experiences, I was probably still learning multiplication tables in school. That thought got stuck in my head in a strange way. In another call, he asked if I was nervous about the wedding. I laughed humorlessly before saying yes, a little. He was quiet for a few seconds before saying, "That's normal. With time, you'll get used to me." Get used to. That hit me in an unexpected way because I didn't want to get used to someone. I wanted to feel something real, to feel desire, choice, connection. But everything felt more like a ready-made path, where I simply walked along without being able to stop. The weeks passed too quickly. Soon the pre-wedding ceremonies began, and my house turned into a place full of voices, strong perfumes, and people coming and going constantly. The women in the family surrounded me smiling, saying how beautiful I looked, what a real bride I seemed. And I smiled back because I no longer knew what else to do. At the first dress fitting, I wanted to cry the moment I looked at myself in the mirror. Not because the dress was ugly. In fact, it was beautiful. The problem was the strange feeling of looking at myself and not recognizing who I saw. It felt as though I was seeing another person. My mother noticed my silence that day and tried to hug me, but I pulled away without meaning to. Not because I was angry with her, but because in that moment, any touch seemed to make my heart hurt even more. That night, we had one of the most honest conversations of our lives. She came into my room after everyone had gone to sleep and sat beside me on the bed. We were silent for a few seconds until I finally asked, "Were you happy in your marriage?" My mother took a very long time to answer, so long that I started to think she simply wouldn't. Then she took a deep breath and said, "Happiness changes with time." That confused me. "But did you love Dad?" She looked at me with a weary sadness in her eyes. "I learned to love him." I knew she was trying to comfort me. I really did. But instead, I felt even more frightened. Because for the first time, I realized that perhaps many of the women around me had spent their entire lives trying to turn resignation into love. When my mother left the room, I lay awake until late thinking about that. Outside, I could hear music coming from some distant party in the neighborhood. People laughing, cars passing, dogs barking. Life went on normally for everyone except me. Then came the night before the wedding. My house was packed with relatives, and the noise was so great that my head began to throb. Everyone seemed far too happy. My cousins were taking photos, my aunts were giving orders throughout the house, and I felt an overwhelming urge to disappear for a few hours. At one point, I went to the bathroom just to breathe alone. I locked the door and stared at my reflection in the mirror. I looked exhausted, older, like someone who needed more time to think about her own life. But there was no more time. It was in that moment that I seriously thought about running away. Not in a dramatic way, not like in the movies. It was a quiet, almost desperate thought. I picked up my phone, thought about calling someone, imagined taking a bus somewhere far away. But reality quickly returned. I didn't have enough money, I had no plan, I had nowhere to go. So I just washed my face and went back to the party pretending everything was fine. Nobody noticed anything, or perhaps nobody wanted to notice. In the early hours of that same day, already in bed, I heard my mother coming quietly into the room. She sat beside me and began stroking my hair the way she did when I was a child. It was then that I asked the thing that had been destroying me from the inside for weeks. "Is there still time to call it off?" She stopped immediately. The silence became so heavy that I started to regret the question. My mother closed her eyes for a few seconds before answering. "It would be very difficult now. Difficult, not impossible. Difficult." And that difference stayed lodged inside me while I tried to sleep, knowing that in a few hours, my life would change forever. On the day of the wedding, I woke before dawn. In truth, I don't know if I can say I slept. I spent most of the night staring at the ceiling while listening to the sounds of the house. People walking through the hallways, doors opening and closing, low voices coming from the kitchen. My mother and aunts had been up since early organizing everything, and that constant movement made it feel as though I were being carried along by a current I couldn't stop. When I got out of bed, I stood for a few seconds in front of the mirror. I looked exhausted, with swollen eyes, a pale face, the expression of someone who wanted more time to think about her own life, but there was no more time. The following hours passed in a blur. Women coming into the room constantly, makeup, hair, jewelry, fabric spread across the bed, a strong smell of perfume and hairspray. Everyone spoke at once, and I could barely follow the conversations. I heard phrases like, "You look radiant," "Your husband will be enchanted," "How lucky to be marrying such an established man." Always the same idea: stability, security, respect. As though those words were enough to calm what I was feeling. While they prepared me, I kept looking down at my own hands in my lap. They trembled slightly, though I tried to hide it. One of my cousins noticed and laughed. You're nervous like every bride. But that didn't feel like normal nerves. It felt like fear. Shortly before the ceremony, my mother asked to be alone with me for a few minutes. When everyone had left the room, she approached slowly and adjusted part of my veil that was already perfectly in place. It was clearly an excuse to touch me. Then she held my face in her hands and said, "Whatever happens, you will always be my daughter." It was the first time I saw fear in her eyes, too. Up until that moment, I had been trying to convince myself that perhaps I was overreacting, perhaps being immature or dramatic. But in that instant, I understood that my mother also knew I was frightened. Perhaps she simply didn't know how to turn back. When the time came to leave, my legs felt heavy. I remember the sound of people talking, the bright lights, and the music playing in the background as I walked slowly. Everyone smiled at me. Some relatives even cried with emotion, and I felt completely detached from all of it. Then I saw him waiting for the ceremony. For the first time, the age difference struck me in an almost physical way. Not because he looked too old, but because I looked too young. While he remained composed, greeting people and conversing naturally, I felt like disappearing. My heart was beating so hard I began to think I would genuinely faint. When we finally stood side by side, I noticed something simple that left me strangely unsettled. The way he seemed so sure of himself in that situation while I felt completely lost. It was as though we were living different moments in life. Throughout the entire ceremony, I tried to keep my gaze fixed on some distant point, so I wouldn't start crying in front of everyone. When he took my hand, I felt another tightening in my chest. His hand felt much larger than mine. That may seem like a trivial detail, but in that moment it symbolized everything I was feeling. I felt far too small inside that life. After the ceremony came the photos, the embraces, and the endless congratulations. I smiled automatically while listening to people wish us happiness, prosperity, and a long life together. A woman from his family held my face and said, smiling, "You'll take very good care of him." That kept echoing in my head. Take care of him. In that moment, I realized that nobody saw me as a 19-year-old girl anymore. I was already being placed in the role of wife, homemaker, a woman responsible for someone else. The party ended late, and I already felt emotionally drained when we finally got into the car to leave. It was strange to realize I was leaving the house where I had grown up, knowing that from that point on, everything would be different. My mother cried when she hugged me before I got into the car. My father tried to appear composed, but his eyes were red too. For the first time that day, I almost gave up on everything. Almost. But then I heard people around us watching, commenting, smiling, taking photos, and I felt there was no longer any space to turn back. During the drive, I stared out the window in silence, while the city lights passed quickly outside. He noticed my nerves and asked if I was tired. I nodded slowly. He hesitated before speaking again. "I know all of this must be hard for you." That phrase surprised me so much that I turned to look at him. It was the first time I felt that he might be sensing something of what was happening inside me, but at the same time, it confused me too. Because if he could sense my fear, why did he keep going through with all of it? I couldn't bring myself to ask. When we arrived at his house, our house now, I felt another strange tightening in my chest. It was a beautiful house, much larger than my parents' home. Everything organized, clean, almost immaculate. Every object seemed to have its exact place. Even the clock in the living room seemed to make too much noise in that silence. It felt like the house of someone who had already lived an entire life, and I had barely begun to live mine. He noticed I was observing everything in silence and said, "You'll get used to it." That word again. Get used to it. I smiled faintly, just so as not to create discomfort. Later, when I was finally alone in the bathroom taking off my makeup, I stared at my reflection for a long time. I was married. The word felt absurd inside my head. As I slowly removed my earrings and let down my hair, a different kind of fear began to surface. It was no longer fear of the wedding happening, because by now it already had. It was fear of the future, of the silence in that house, of the unfamiliar routine, of the distance between us, of the constant feeling of not fully belonging to that life. When I came out of the bathroom, he was sitting on the bed reading something on his phone, completely calm, as if this were just another normal day. I stood still by the door, not knowing what to do. He looked up at me and smiled gently. "You can relax. You don't need to be so frightened of me." The words were spoken calmly, without irony, without malice. But for some reason, my eyes filled with tears immediately. Perhaps because, for the first time that entire day, someone had finally said out loud what I had been trying to hide from the very beginning. I was frightened. The first days in his house were stranger than I can explain. Everything felt too quiet. In my parents' house, there was always noise. my mother calling someone from the kitchen, my father watching television too loudly, neighbors chatting in the street, children running through the hallway. I grew up in the middle of that constant movement, that feeling of people always coming and going. His house was not like that. It was organized, clean, almost impeccable. Every object seemed to have its exact place. Even the clock in the living room seemed to make too much noise in that silence. On the first morning after the wedding, I woke before him and spent a few seconds not knowing where I was. Then I heard the soft sound of the air conditioning, saw the unfamiliar furniture around me, and felt that tightening in my chest return immediately. I got up slowly so as not to wake him and went to the kitchen. I stood there looking at the cupboards without quite knowing what to do. It was strange to think that this was now my home too. While I was preparing tea, I heard footsteps coming down the hall. When he entered the kitchen, he was already dressed for work, rested, calm, like someone following his own routine normally. He noticed my nervousness immediately and said, "You don't need to try to make everything perfect." It was the first time he said something like that, and it caught me off guard, because honestly, I was trying to speak the right way, move the right way, seem calm, seem mature, trying to quickly transform myself into someone I was not yet. After he left for work, I was alone in the house for the first time, and it was awful. The hours passed too slowly. I tried watching television, scrolling through my phone, helping the housekeeper, organizing my clothes, but nothing eased that feeling of emptiness. For the first time since the wedding, I genuinely missed home. I missed the smell of my mother's cooking, the noise of the street, even the silly arguments between my siblings. I sat down on the living room sofa and began to cry without noticing. It wasn't despair. It was a quiet, heavy sadness, difficult to explain. The feeling that I had left an entire life behind too quickly. That afternoon, my mother called. The moment I heard her voice, I had to hold back the tears. She asked how I was, how the first night had been, whether he was treating me well. I said yes to everything, because it was true. He was being kind, and that made everything even more complicated. If he had been cruel, arrogant, or aggressive, perhaps I would have known exactly what to feel. But he seemed genuinely trying to make me comfortable, while I continued to feel out of place inside this new life. When I hung up, I thought about that for a long time. Perhaps the problem wasn't him. Perhaps it was me. Perhaps I was too immature, too young, too frightened. I spent hours trying to convince myself of that. That evening, he took me to dinner at an elegant restaurant that made me feel uncomfortable from the moment we walked in. The people seemed too sophisticated, the atmosphere too quiet, everything very different from the simple places I used to go with my friends. I felt like a child trying to pretend she belonged in that world. During dinner, he tried to make normal conversation. He asked about my childhood, my tastes, the books I read. In several moments, he seemed genuinely interested in what I said, but there was an invisible distance between us. When I talked about my friends, about school, or about simple things from my life, he would smile with an almost nostalgic expression, like someone listening to memories of a phase already very far away. And that made me even more conscious of the age gap. At one point, he mentioned a trip he had taken years before, and casually said that I must have been very little at the time. It was said without any unkindness, but it kept hammering in my head for the rest of the evening. After dinner, we walked for a while before going home. The city was beautiful at night, full of lights and people on the streets, but I still felt strangely detached from everything. It was during that walk that he asked a question that left me speechless. "Did you want to continue studying?" I looked at him in surprise, because nobody had asked me that since the wedding began to be planned. "Yes," I answered almost automatically. He was silent for a few seconds. Then continue. The answer confused me. In my mind, after the wedding, my life would be completely different. I imagined my choices would end there, replaced by the household routine, the family's expectations, the role of wife. But he seemed genuinely at ease with the idea. That night, lying in bed beside him, I thought about that for hours. Perhaps I had built a worse image of him than he truly was. Perhaps I was judging everything only by age. Perhaps there was still room for me to find some happiness in that life. But at the same time, something inside me continued to be restless. Because kindness does not erase emotional distance. And that distance showed up constantly in small details. In the way he spoke about the future while I still longed for the past. In the way he seemed ready for stability, while I still wanted to discover who I was. In the way he already had answers for everything while I was still full of questions. As the weeks passed, I began to notice something else. People around us would look at us, sometimes discreetly, sometimes not. In restaurants, shops, or family gatherings, I would catch glances that were too quick to be coincidental. Some women smiled at me with thinly veiled pity. Some men seemed too curious. And that began to bother me deeply. One afternoon, while we were at a shopping center, I overheard two girls roughly my age whispering nearby. I couldn't catch everything, but I clearly heard one of them say, "She looks like his daughter." That phrase went into my head like a needle. I tried to act normally, but my face burned with embarrassment immediately. He noticed. In the car, he asked what had happened, and after I told him, he sat holding the steering wheel for a few seconds without saying anything. Then he took a deep breath and said, "People will always find something to comment on." Perhaps he was right, but that didn't ease the discomfort, because I thought that sometimes too, and admitting it made me feel guilty. That night, after he fell asleep, I sat alone on the balcony watching the city lights. For the first time since the wedding, I began to ask myself something I had until then been trying to avoid. What if I never managed to love that man the way a wife should? The months began to pass, but the feeling of strangeness did not disappear the way everyone said it would. People kept saying I would get used to it, that marriage was like that in the beginning, that love came with time, and I tried to believe it. I made an effort to adapt to the household routine, to talk more with him, to seem less lost. On some days, I even managed to convince myself that things were improving, but then something small would happen and all that feeling would come back. Sometimes it was the way he spoke with his friends about subjects I barely understood. Other times it was realizing that he had references, experiences, and memories from a full adult life while I still felt stuck between adolescence and something I didn't even know how to define. One evening, we went to dinner with some of his friends, and that was one of the moments when I felt most out of place since the wedding. Everyone was older. The conversations revolved around business, investments, work problems, children, schools, international travel. In many moments, I simply sat in silence holding a glass in my hands while trying to follow the topics. One of the women asked my age, and when I answered 19, there was that small, uncomfortable silence that people try to disguise with quick smiles. She looked at me, then at him, and said, "My goodness, you're very young." It was said politely, but the atmosphere changed after that. For the first time, I felt ashamed of my own marriage. On the way home, I sat quietly looking out the car window. He noticed. "You were uncomfortable tonight," he said, and it wasn't a question, it was a statement. I took a deep breath before answering. "Sometimes I feel like I don't belong in your life." He was silent for a few seconds. "You belong now." The answer should have reassured me, but it didn't, because that was precisely the problem. I had entered a life that already seemed complete before I had even arrived. That same week, I started attending classes again. He truly kept his promise that I could continue studying, and that was one of the first things that gave me a little relief since the wedding, but it also brought new conflicts. On the first day, I immediately felt different from the other girls. While they talked about parties, relationships, trips with friends, and plans for the future, I hid my ring inside my coat sleeve because I didn't want to explain anything to anyone. For a few days, I managed to avoid the subject, until a classmate noticed. "You're married? Seriously? How old is he?" When I answered 39, she tried to hide her reaction, but I saw it. Everyone always tried to hide it, and perhaps that was the worst part. That afternoon, I went home feeling terrible. I kept thinking about the way people reacted when they found out about our age gap. Always that split second of surprise, that glance held a moment too long, that polite attempt not to seem judgmental. But they were judging, and deep down, I judged too sometimes. It was during this period that I began to notice something else that was hard to admit. I was starting to feel angry at him for no clear reason. Not because he treated me badly, not because he was cruel, but because his constant presence reminded me of the life I might not have chosen for myself, and I hated myself for feeling that. There were days when he came home from work tired and tried to talk to me normally, while I responded coldly without even realizing it. At other times, he did small kindnesses, brought something I liked, asked about my classes, tried to include my interests in conversations, and that made me feel even worse, because he seemed sincerely trying to make it work. One night we had our first real argument. It wasn't an explosive fight. It was worse. It was silent. I was studying in the living room when he casually mentioned a business dinner that would happen at the weekend, saying he wanted me to come along. I answered without thinking, "I don't like those places." He seemed surprised. "You didn't even try this time." I took a deep breath, trying to control my irritation, because I always feel out of place. He observed me for a few seconds before asking, "Out of place, why?" The question irritated me immediately, perhaps because I knew he already knew the answer. Because I'm 19. The silence that followed became instantly heavy. He looked away first. Do you think I don't notice that? That sentence completely changed the tone of the conversation. For the first time, I sensed something different in his voice. Exhaustion, perhaps guilt too. I should have stopped there, but I couldn't. Then why did you want to marry me? The moment I asked, I regretted it. He went a long time without answering. Then he ran his hands slowly over his face and spoke in an almost weary tone. Because I thought we could build a life together. The answer seemed sincere, but it resolved nothing. That night we slept in silence, turned toward opposite sides of the bed. And for the first time since the wedding, I began to sense that perhaps he was also unhappy in a way he didn't show. In the following days, the distance between us became more evident. There were no shouts, no aggression, only silence. And silence can hurt a great deal when two people no longer know how to reach each other. One afternoon, while organizing some drawers in the house, I found an old box full of photographs of him when he was younger. I saw photos of trips, friends, parties, moments from a life that had happened long before I had even imagined who he was. In one of the photos, he looked close to my current age. I stared at that image for a long time because I suddenly realized something I had never considered before. When he was 19, he was probably living his youth freely, while I, at 19, was already trying to learn how to be a wife. That struck me in an unexpected way. I sat on the floor of the room holding the photo in my hands and began to cry alone. It wasn't hatred of him, nor hatred of my family. It was grief. Grief for the version of my life that might never exist anymore. That evening, when he came home, he immediately noticed my red eyes and asked what had happened. For the first time since the wedding, I wanted to tell him the whole truth, to say that I was tired, confused, sad, lost. But the words got stuck in my throat, so I just answered, nothing. And in that moment, I realized how much I was losing myself inside that marriage. After that argument, something changed between us. It wasn't a dramatic change. There were no great fights or impulsive decisions. It was something quieter, almost invisible at first, like a small crack appearing in a beautiful wall. From a distance, nobody notices. But whoever lives inside the house knows it is there. We continued living normally. We had coffee together, talked about the day's events, went out sometimes, slept in the same bed. From the outside, we looked like a couple trying to adapt. But inside, I felt a growing distance between us, and I think he felt it too. I began to notice small signs of weariness in him. Sometimes he would watch me in silence for too long, as if trying to understand something he couldn't quite reach. At other times, he seemed to give up on a conversation before it had even begun. Perhaps he had come to realize that I had never truly managed to give myself fully to that life. The classes ended up becoming my only place to breathe. It was strange because, even though I sometimes felt out of place there too, I also felt alive. I enjoyed hearing people my age talking about dreams, insecurities, impulsive plans. For the first time in many months, I could forget for a few hours the constant weight I carried at home. And it was precisely that which started to create another problem. I no longer wanted to go home so early. After classes, I began spending more time in the library, having coffee with classmates or simply wandering without direction before going back. I wasn't doing anything wrong. I just needed to breathe a little before stepping back into a routine that still felt too tight for me. One day he noticed. I had arrived almost an hour later than usual. When I came in, I found the living room dark and him sitting alone on the sofa with a tired expression. "You could have let me know," he said without aggression, but with something different there. I sat down slowly and apologized, said I had lost track of time. He looked at me for a few seconds before asking, "Do you avoid coming home?" The question caught me completely off guard. For a few seconds, I thought about lying, but I was tired of lying, so I lowered my eyes and answered quietly, "Sometimes." He took a deep breath and looked away. The silence between us became heavy. It was then that he said something I will never forget. I think we both knew this would be hard. In that moment, for the first time, I felt sorry for him too, because for a long time I had seen myself only as the person trapped in that situation. But looking at him that night, I saw a man trying to build a life with someone who had never quite managed to reach him emotionally, and that must have hurt too. We talked for a long time that night. It was perhaps the most honest conversation we had since the wedding. I told him I felt lost, that sometimes I had the feeling of having skipped important stages of life, that I couldn't keep up with his maturity. I told him about the looks from people, about the constant discomfort, about the guilt I felt for not being able to simply get used to it. He listened to everything in silence, without interrupting, without defending himself. When I finished, he stared at his own hands for a few seconds before saying, "I thought the age difference would matter less over time." The honesty of that sentence hurt more than I expected, because it finally felt like someone was telling the truth out loud. The difference mattered. It mattered in the silences, in the conversations, in the way we saw life, in our expectations, our desires, even in the way time seemed to pass differently for each of us. That night we barely slept, but strangely, after that conversation I began to feel lighter. Not because the problems had disappeared, they were still there. Only for the first time, nobody was pretending everything was perfect. A few days later, I visited my parents alone. My mother immediately noticed something different in me. While we were preparing tea in the kitchen, she watched me in silence until finally asking, "Are you happy?" It was the first time she asked me that directly, and it nearly made me cry on the spot, because for months I had waited for someone to truly ask me that. I looked at my mother and noticed how much more tired she seemed too. Perhaps she carried guilt she had never had the courage to admit. I took a deep breath before answering, "I'm trying to understand my life." She immediately looked down. We were silent for a few seconds until she said quietly, "I thought I was doing what was best for you." And I believe she truly thought so. That is the hardest part of the whole story. There was no simple villain, no clear malice. There were people trying to do right by using what they had learned about life. But good intentions don't always prevent someone from suffering. On the way back home, I thought about that for the whole journey. I thought about how many women might have lived through similar situations without ever being able to speak about what they truly felt. I thought about how many had learned to call resignation happiness because it was easier than facing their own sadness. And I thought about myself, about the 19-year-old girl who looked out at the world through her bedroom window, imagining what the future would be like. She was still there somewhere inside me. I just needed to discover who I had become after all of that. That night, when I arrived home, I found him sitting on the balcony reading. He looked up when he saw me and asked how it had been. For the first time in a long while, I sat beside him without feeling that immediate need to withdraw emotionally. We sat in silence watching the city lights for a few minutes. Then I said something I had never managed to say before. I think we were both placed into a life we had imagined differently. He was quiet for a few seconds before nodding, and that small gesture moved me deeply, because perhaps that was the first time we stopped acting like a husband and wife trying to meet expectations and began acting simply as two people trying to figure out what to do with their own lives. I cannot say that everything was resolved after that. Life doesn't work that way. But I can say that it was in that moment that I began, for the first time since the wedding, to feel that my voice still existed. Sonnet 4. Six Claude é uma IA e pode cometer erros. Por favor, verifique as respostas.